It was one of those days that started like any other. The sun was high. The streets buzzed with the usual rhythm of life, and Officer Mark Harris was patrolling his usual route, nodding at familiar faces and keeping an eye out for anything out of the ordinary. But this day would be anything but ordinary. As he turned the corner onto Elm Street, he noticed her, a young black girl, no older than 10, standing on the sidewalk. Her big, curious eyes locked onto him, and for a moment, it felt like the world had paused. She wasn't just looking at him. She was studying him, as if trying to decide whether to trust him. And then, she started following him. At first, Mark thought nothing of it. Kids were curious, after all. Maybe she was just fascinated by his uniform or the shiny badge on his chest. But as he continued his patrol, he realized she wasn't just trailing behind him casually. She was keeping pace, staying close, her small feet shuffling quickly to match his stride. Every time he glanced back, she was there, her face a mix of determination and something else, something he couldn't quite place. Fear? Hope? It was hard to tell. He stopped once, crouched down to her level, and asked gently, "Hey, sweetheart, are you okay? Do you need something?" But she didn't answer. She just stared at him, her lips pressed together tightly, as if she was holding back a flood of words. The strange encounter lingered in Mark's mind as he continued his rounds. He tried to shake it off, telling himself she was just a kid being a kid. But something about her silence, her persistence, gnawed at him. Why was she following him? Where were her parents? The questions swirled in his head, but he didn't have time to dwell on them. Duty called, and he had a job to do. Still, every so often, he'd glance over his shoulder, and there she was, always a few steps behind, always watching. Hours passed, and the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the pavement. Mark was about to call it a day when he noticed the girl again, this time standing under a flickering streetlight. Her small frame looked even more fragile in the dim glow, and for the first time, he saw something in her hands, a crumpled piece of paper. She held it tightly, her knuckles white, as if it was the most important thing in the world. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He knew, deep down, that this wasn't just a random encounter anymore. Whatever was on that paper, whatever she was carrying, it mattered. It mattered a lot. He approached her slowly, his boots clicking against the pavement. "Hey," he said softly, kneeling down again. "What's that you've got there?" For a moment, she hesitated, her eyes darting around as if she was afraid someone might be watching. Then, with trembling hands, she held out the paper. Mark took it, his fingers brushing against hers, and unfolded it carefully. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a note, scribbled in messy, childlike handwriting. And as he read the words, his heart sank. The message was short, but it carried a weight that hit him like a punch to the gut. "Please help me," it said. "He's hurting her." Mark's mind raced. Who was he? Who was her? Was this girl in danger? Was someone else? He looked up at her, his voice urgent but gentle. "Who wrote this? What's going on?" But before she could answer, a loud noise shattered the quiet evening. A car door slamming shut, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. The girl's eyes widened in terror, and she took a step back, shaking her head frantically. Mark's instincts kicked in. He stood up, shielding her with his body, and turned toward the sound. But what he saw next left him frozen in place. A man was storming toward them, his face twisted in anger, his eyes locked on the girl. "There you are," he barked, his voice sharp and menacing. "I told you not to run off." Mark's hand instinctively went to his radio, but before he could call for backup, the girl did something he never expected. She grabbed his arm, her tiny fingers gripping him with surprising strength, and whispered two words that sent a chill down his spine. "Help us." And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she let go and darted away, disappearing into the shadows. Mark was left standing there, the note still clutched in his hand, his mind spinning with questions. Who was this girl? What was she running from? And why did he feel like this was just the beginning of something much bigger, much darker. The tension in the air was palpable as Mark stared into the darkness where the girl had vanished. He knew he couldn't let this go. He had to find her, to uncover the truth behind that desperate plea for help. But as he took a step forward, the man who had been chasing her stepped into the light, his expression unreadable. "Officer," he said, his voice low and steady, "you don't want to get involved in this." Mark's jaw tightened. He didn't know who this man was or what he was capable of, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just a routine call anymore. This was a mystery that would test everything he thought he knew about justice, courage, and the lengths one little girl would go to for the people she loved. And as the night deepened, Mark realized that the choices he made in the next few moments could change everything, for her, for him, and for everyone involved. But what would he do? What could he do? The answers were out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. And as the first drops of rain began to fall, Mark knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The rain began to fall harder, each drop hitting the pavement like a tiny drumbeat, echoing the pounding. In Mark's chest, he stood there, frozen for a moment, the crumpled note still in his hand, the words, "Please help me," now smudged by the rain. The man who had called out to him was still standing a few feet away, his eyes narrowed, his posture tense. Mark's training kicked in, and he straightened up, his voice firm but calm. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back," he said, his hand resting on the radio at his side. "I need to ask you a few questions." The man didn't move. If anything, he seemed to grow more agitated, his jaw tightening as he glanced toward the shadows where the girl had disappeared. "Look, officer," he said, his voice strained, "this is a family matter. It's not what you think. That girl, she's got a wild imagination, always making up stories. You don't want to get caught up in her nonsense." Mark's eyes narrowed. He'd heard that line before, too many times. People trying to downplay, to deflect, to make it seem like nothing was wrong when everything was. But the fear in the girl's eyes, the desperation in her note, that wasn't imagination. That was real. "I'll be the judge of that," Mark said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Now, I need you to tell me who you are and what your relationship is to that girl." The man hesitated, his eyes darting around as if he was searching for an escape route. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his rain-soaked hair. "Fine," he said. "I'm her uncle. Her mom's been going through a rough patch. I've been looking after her, but she's a handful, always running off, causing trouble. I was just trying to bring her home." Mark studied the man carefully, trying to read him. There was something off about his story, something that didn't quite add up. If he was really her uncle, why had the girl looked so terrified? Why had she handed Mark that note instead of going to him? And why was he so eager to dismiss her as a troublemaker? Mark's instincts were screaming at him that there was more to this story, but he knew he had to tread carefully. He couldn't just accuse the man of anything without evidence. "Not yet." "All right," Mark said, keeping his voice neutral. "Why don't you come down to the station with me? We can sort this out there. Get everything on the record." The man's eyes widened, and for a split second, Mark thought he might bolt. But then he nodded, his shoulders slumping in resignation. "Fine," he muttered. "But this is a waste of time. That girl's always been trouble." Mark didn't respond. He just gestured for the man to follow him to the patrol car, his mind racing. He needed to find the girl. He needed to know what she was running from. But first, he had to handle this, whatever. This was .as they drove to the station. The rain continued to pour, the windshield wipers working overtime to keep the glass clear. Mark kept glancing at the man in the rearview mirror, trying to piece together the puzzle. He looked ordinary enough, mid-40s, average build, dressed in a plain jacket and jeans. But there was a tension in his posture, a restlessness that made Mark uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something this man wasn't telling him. When they arrived at the station, Mark led the man inside and handed him off to another officer for questioning. He needed a moment to think, to process everything that had happened. He found a quiet corner and pulled out the note again, smoothing it out on the table. The words were still there, faint but legible. "Please help me." He's hurting her. Who was her? The girl's mother? Someone else? And what did hurting mean? Mark's stomach churned at the possibilities. He had seen enough in his years on the force to know that things weren't always what they seemed. Sometimes, the people who were supposed to protect you were the ones you needed protection from. He pulled out his phone and quickly typed in a search for missing persons reports in the area, looking for anything that might match the girl's description. Nothing came up. That didn't necessarily mean anything. Not every case made it into the system, but it made his job harder. He needed more information, and he needed it fast. He thought back to the girl's face, the way she had looked at him with those big, pleading eyes. She had trusted him enough to give him that note. He couldn't let her down. Mark stood up, his resolve hardening. He needed to find her. He needed to know the truth. But where to start? The streets were vast, and she could be anywhere. He thought about the area where he had first seen her, the flickering streetlight, the shadows she had disappeared into. Maybe she was still nearby. Maybe she was hiding, waiting for him to come back. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, ignoring the curious looks from his colleagues. He didn't have time to explain. Not why ETS he stepped back out into the rain. His mind was a whirlwind of questions and possibilities. Who was this girl? What was she running from? And why had she chosen him, of all people, to trust? He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stop until he found them. The night was far from over, and somewhere out there, a little girl was counting on him. He just hoped he wasn't too late. The streets were quieter now, the rain driving most people indoors. Mark walked slowly, his eyes scanning every shadow, every alleyway, every doorway. He called out softly, "Hey, it's me, the officer. I'm here to help." But there was no response, just the sound of the rain and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. He kept walking, his heart heavy but determined. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew he had to keep looking, and then, just as he was about to turn back, he saw it. A small movement in the darkness, a flicker of something. That caught his eye. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. There, huddled under a broken awning, was the girl. She was soaked to the bone, her clothes clinging to her small frame, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and fearful, but this time, there was something else in her gaze, a glimmer of hope. Mark crouched down, keeping his distance so as not to scare her. "Hey," he said softly. "It's okay. You're safe now. I'm here to help." She didn't say anything, but she didn't run either. She just stared at him, her chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out the note, holding it up so she could see it. "I read this," he said. "I want to help, but I need you to tell me what's going on. Who's hurting her? Who are you trying to protect?" The girl's lower lip trembled, and for a moment, Mark thought she might cry. But then she took a deep breath and whispered, "My mom." Her voice was so quiet he almost didn't hear it, but those two words hit him like a ton of bricks. His heart ached for her, for the weight she was carrying at such a young age. He nodded slowly, his voice gentle. "Okay," he said. "Tell me everything. I'm here to listen. I'm here to help." But before she could say another word, a sound broke through the night. A car engine roaring to life, tires screeching against the wet pavement. Mark's head snapped up, his instincts on high alert. He turned just in time to see a dark sedan speeding toward them, its headlights blinding in the rain. The girl let out a small cry, scrambling to her feet. Mark reached for her, but it was too late. The car skidded to a stop, the passenger door flew open, and a voice barked out, "Get in, now." Mark's heart raced as he realized what was happening. He stepped forward, his hand going to his holster, but the girl was already moving, her small frame darting toward the car. "Wait," he shouted, but she didn't stop. She climbed into the car, the door slammed shut, and the tires squealed as the car sped off into the night. Mark stood there, frozen, his mind reeling. What had just happened? Who was in that car? And why had the girl gone with them? The rain continued to fall, soaking him to the skin, but he barely noticed. All he could think about was the look on the girl's face as she climbed into that car. a look of resignation, of fear, but also of something else. Something that made his stomach twist with dread. He didn't know what he had just stumbled into, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And as he stood there in the pouring rain, watching the taillights disappear into the darkness, he made a silent promise to himself and to her. He would find her. No matter what it took, he would find her. And he would make sure she was safe.